a girl can survive a German patrol and still be betrayed by one footprint in the mud. This is not a story about clean heroism or easy victory, but about female partisans who learn to turn forest paths, hidden bread, silent signals, and broken railway lines into weapons against the Nazi war machine. Every train they struck could slow the enemy, but every success could bring dogs, burned homes, and terrified villages behind them. Tonight, we follow one young woman into the dark forest, where courage means staying silent long enough to live. Before you settle in, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if these slow human stories from history are the kind you truly enjoy. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and what time it is there. I always like knowing who is listening in the dark, somewhere far away, while these forgotten lives return for a little while. Now, dim the lights. Let the room grow still. Tonight, we step into the wet forest with the women who learned that even one German train could make an entire village hold its breath. If someone crossed the edge of that field at night, they might have seen only a railway line, wet grass, and a wall of black forest behind it. The track did not look like a battlefield, because there were no trenches, no broken houses, and no bodies in the open. It was only 2 strips of cold metal running through the countryside, quiet until the next train came, but she knew better. The young woman lay low behind the bushes, her brown coat dark with damp, one hand gripping the cloth near her chest so her fingers would not shake. Behind her, the forest was familiar. In front of her, the railway belonged to the Germans, and every meter seemed watched even when guard was visible. She stayed flat in silence. Far down the line, a small orange glow appeared before the full sound reached her. The rails began to tremble, lightly at first, then with a hard rhythm that passed through the stones and into the ground beneath her ribs. The engine came out of the dark with fire in its mouth, pushing smoke above the field and pulling wagons behind it. Some might have carried soldiers, ammunition, fuel, food, or spare parts. She could not know enough. That was part of the fear. A train did not explain itself to the villages it passed. It could carry bullets to one front, bread to one garrison, orders to one command post, or men who would step down before sunrise and knock on doors with rifles. To her, it was war moving on time nightly. The orange light touched the field in broken flashes as the engine came closer. It showed wet grass, pale stones beside the rails, and her knuckles pressing into her coat. She did not blink. This was not bravery in the clean way people remember it later. Bravery here looked mostly like stillness, like holding breath low when every part of the body wanted to crawl backward into the trees. It meant letting the noise pass over her without flinching, while mud soaked into her sleeves and cold climbed through her clothes. Still, she watched. There was a cruel neatness in the train, the kind that made violence look organized simply because it moved by schedule and arrived in sealed wagons. The metal had no anger in it, and the smoke carried no face. The cruelty was hidden in cargo lists, timetables, guards, repair crews, and the habit of reaching the right place at the right hour. The machine worked. Partisan groups in occupied regions understood this clearly. They did not always have heavy weapons or enough ammunition. They could not meet German power directly, so they studied the places where that power had to pass. Railways, bridges, supply roads, depots, crossings and wires that kept the occupation connected. An army did not move by courage alone, it moved by supply. The railway was a vein inside the German war machine, carrying men, orders, fuel, from one place to another. If that vein kept working, the occupation could keep breathing. If it failed, even briefly, something larger than one train would slow. That thought was dangerous. She had not been born for work like this. No one had raised her to lie beside railway lines at night and count German wagons through smoke. She had known wells, kitchens, muddy yards, firewood, neighbours, market baskets, and the small worries of village life. She knew which path stayed dry after rain. That had once been enough. War took those ordinary facts and changed their use. A path through trees became a route for messages. A basket could hide bread for people who could not safely enter the village. Memory could beat a printed map in a patrolman's hands. The old life became covered. In a peaceful town, a delayed train might mean a missed shift or a person staring angrily at a clock. Still, here, one delayed German train could mean ammunition arriving late or a patrol reaching a village after people had already run. That did not make the choice clean. It did not turn fear into glory or danger into a simple story. It only made the railway impossible to see as harmless again. The trap was ordinary. She watched the wagons pass and tried to imagine where they were going. Maybe they were bound for a frozen front, a guarded town, a repair depot, or a command post where orders would be stamped and sent on. The more she imagined, the less distant the train felt. It was personal. Anger came to her quietly. It came from seized grain, missing neighbours, locked doors, and the careful silence that fell whenever German soldiers stood near. The train carried all of that forward without knowing it. Her anger stayed low. Low anger was safer. Loud anger brought searches, shouted orders, rifle butts against doors, and families forced into yards before sunrise. People survived by lowering their voices, shortening their glances, and pretending life had not been broken beyond repair. Silence kept them alive. The final wagons passed, darker than the engine, their shapes cutting through orange light before sinking back into the night. A red lamp at the rear glowed as it moved along the Herve, then disappeared behind the trees. Even after the sound thinned out, she did not rise, because patrols sometimes followed. Danger did not end with silence. The most disturbing part was how little had happened on the surface. Because no shot was fired, no order was shouted, and yet a frightened girl in the mud had already begun choosing a side. She did not stand like a hero from a poster. She stayed flat and cold while her mind moved the railway into a new category. It was no longer scenery, it was a target. Only then did she pull herself back from the bushes. Her fingers were numb, and dirt clung to the sleeves of her coat. She looked once at the ant rails, then turned toward the forest path that would take her away from them. The German train passed safely through the dark, but the girl behind the bushes had stopped seeing the railway as harmless metal. Her way back through the trees would lead toward the life she once knew. When the forest paths behind her village were only routes for firewood, mushrooms, and small errands, those same harmless paths would soon become the only reason she could survive when German patrols, informers, and dogs began closing around the forest. Before she ever watched a German train from the edge of the forest, she had known those trees more quietly. She had walked there with a basket hanging from her wrist, the handle pressing a red mark into her palm, while mud gathered around the heels of her boots. She knew where mushrooms grew after rain, and where fallen branches dried fastest. None of it felt dangerous then. The forest was part of the village's daily life. Women entered it for firewood, children followed older brothers along narrow paths, and men checked traps when work allowed. She knew the bent tree near the lower path, the soft patch of earth that swallowed footprints after a storm, and the bank where moss made the stones slippery. She did not call this knowledge useful. It was home. Sometimes she carried small notes between houses. A folded paper might ask about borrowed flour, a sick relative, or whether someone had seen a missing goat near the fields. She walked with her eyes down enough to seem polite, but not so low that she looked afraid. People trusted her because she was local, young and ordinary. That made her easy to miss. Her first training was made of chores. She learned how far she could walk before the basket rubbed her wrist, got sore, how to balance damp wood against her hip, and how to step around a puddle. She knew which paths could take a cart, which ones forced a person to go single file, and where the ground rose enough to see the road below. Later, they mattered. After the Germans came, the same paths began to change. A trail used for mushrooms could take someone around a checkpoint. A stream could break up footprints before dogs reached the soft road. A hollow beneath roots could hide a parcel wrapped in cloth. A girl with a basket could pass where a man might be stopped. The Germans brought maps, orders, and uniforms, but the mud still belonged to people who had stepped in it since childhood. They could mark roads on paper, but they did not know which shortcut flooded first, which fence creaked, or which path ended at an open field. Local people carried that knowledge in their feet and hands. The soldiers had power, the villagers had memory. At home, her old life still tried to continue. Her mother might hand her the same basket and tell her to bring back wood before the evening cold settled in. Her fingers would close around the handle by habit, and for a second, the task felt like something from before. Then a German truck would pass outside, and her shoulder would tighten before she could stop it. The moment broke. That was how occupation entered daily life. It did not always arrive as shouting or shooting. Sometimes it was the soldier standing too long near the road, the notice nailed to a wall, the flower missing from a shelf, or the way adults stopped talking when boots sounded outside. A girl could still walk into the forest. She just counted every glance. In a peaceful village, knowing a shortcut through trees might save a few minutes before supper, but here the same shortcut could keep a messenger alive when German patrols began searching the road. That was why many resistance groups depended on local people. Forests, hills, barns and back lanes became useful because outsiders did not understand them quickly. The landscape helped those who knew it. It punished those who guessed. She did not become a partisan in one clear moment. First, she noticed which soldiers smoked near the corner, then which patrol came late, then which neighbour no longer used a real name after dark. She learned to carry herself normally, even when her stomach tightened. She learned not to look toward the forest too often. The old village was still there, but it no longer felt whole. The house, the well, the road, and the tree line remained in their places, yet each one now had another meaning layered over it. A path could be memory in the morning and an escape by night. A neighbour could be a friend, a helper, or a danger if fear broke them. What hurts most in her story is that her knowledge was never meant for war. Yet the places that once held chores and family errands slowly became the tools that kept her breathing. She remembered back home with muddy feet, tired arms, and bits of leaf stuck to her sleeves. She remembered being annoyed by rain, not terrified of patrols. That older life stayed close, but she could not return to it. By the time she stood before the wooden house with the old basket in her hand, she understood the forest differently. The path behind her was still covered with leaves, and the bent tree still leaned over the lower track. But now she saw hiding places, routes, risks, and ways to move without leaving much behind. Childhood knowledge had become survival. Before she joined any plan, the village and forest had already taught her how to notice paths, mud, silence, and distance. That knowledge would lead her toward the quiet network of people who passed warnings through windows, markets, barns, and half-finished errands. Soon one missing sign, one delayed messenger, or one name spoken too loudly could bring German boots to every door. The village did not look like a place where a resistance network could live. It had the same muddy road, the same wooden houses, the same smoke rising from low chimneys, and the same people carrying buckets, sacks and baskets as if the day were ordinary. A stranger passing through might have seen only poverty, fear and tired faces. But inside that ordinary life, messages moved. An old woman placed a cloth at her window before noon. It looked like laundry, or a habit, or a small attempt to dry something in weak light. Across the road, a boy walked through the market with a little salt in his hand, keeping his steps slow enough not to draw attention. The blacksmith closed his door earlier than usual and wiped his hands on his apron twice before turning the latch. Everyone pretended not to notice. That was how the network survived. Not through grand meetings in the open or brave words spoken where anyone could hear them. It lived inside tiny acts that could still be denied if someone asked too many questions. A cloth could be laundry. A boy could be buying salt. A closed door could mean a tired man wanted rest. The lie had to look boring. Partisans in the forest could not live on rifles alone. They needed bread, potatoes, old coats, bandages, news of patrols, warnings about searches, and places to sleep when the woods became too dangerous. Someone had to watch the road. Someone had to remember which German officer drank too much. Someone had to notice when a truck arrived with dogs. None of that sounded like battle. It kept people alive. The young woman began to understand that her own forest paths were only one small piece of something larger. A person who knew the trees was useful, but so was a grandmother who could sit near a window all day without seeming strange. So was a child who could cross the market without being stopped. So was a man with a shop, a woman with spare bread, or a farmer who knew which barn wall had a loose board. The village had many hands. The strange cruelty of occupation was that even kindness had to disguise itself as a chore. A woman did not simply give food to fighters. She set aside a heel of bread, wrapped it in cloth, and passed it through someone who seemed to be going somewhere else. A man did not announce that patrols had changed. He mentioned a broken wheel, a closed path, or weather that was not really about weather. Help had to wear plain clothes. The danger was in how small everything was. A glance held too long could be noticed. A cloth placed too early could be questioned. A boy who walked too quickly might be followed, and a door that closed at the wrong hour might become a reason for soldiers to return. The village had to speak without seeming to speak. That took discipline. German soldiers stood at a distance on some days, smoking near the road or watching people move between houses. Their uniforms made the street feel narrower. When the young woman passed them with her basket, her shoulder sometimes tightened before she could stop it, and she had to loosen her fingers from the handle so the reeds would not creak. Fear could show in the body before the face. She learned to slow down. In a safer world, neighbours might wave from windows or call across the road without thinking. But here even a folded cloth could decide whether someone in the forest slept safely or walked into a search party. That was the weight of small signs. They looked harmless because they had to. Their power came from being almost invisible. Their danger came from the same thing. No one wanted to say who belonged to the network. Names were heavy. A name could be repeated under pressure, written down by a clerk, traded by an informer, or forced from a frightened person after a beating, so people knew only what they needed. The old woman knew when to place the cloth. The boy knew which stall to pass. The blacksmith knew when to close his door. Each piece was small. That made the whole village feel divided. On the surface, people still bought flour, repaired tools, fed animals, and swept dirt from doorsteps. Underneath, they counted trucks, listened for boots, watched who spoke to whom, and remembered which house had smoke at the wrong hour. A person could live two lives inside the same morning. One life was visible. The other had to stay buried. The young woman saw most clearly when someone looked at her for less than a second, and then turned away. That glance could mean nothing to a German soldier, but to her it could mean the road was unsafe, or a messenger had come, or someone had been taken. Her stomach would tighten, though her feet kept moving. She could not ask. Asking was dangerous. What makes this kind of courage hard to see is that it rarely looked like courage while it was happening. It looked like an old woman sitting near a window with stiff hands in her lap. It looked like a child pretending not to be afraid while passing a soldier twice his size. It looked like a tired neighbour refusing to say a name. It looked ordinary on purpose. The moral burden did not disappear just because the work was quiet. Every person who helped the partisans also pulled danger toward their own doorway. A loaf of bread could feed someone in the forest, but it could also become evidence if found. A warning could save one fighter and bring punishment to a whole street. Nobody in the village could pretend the risk belonged only to those carrying weapons. Still, they helped. Some did it from anger, some from grief, some because a son or brother was gone, and some because they could not bear to do nothing while trains, trucks, and patrols passed through their land. The young woman learned that resistance was not always a group of armed people in the woods. Sometimes it was an old hand placing a cloth on a windowsill. Sometimes it was silence. By evening, the village looked calm again. Smoke drifted low, chickens scratched near fences, and the muddy road held the marks of carts, boots, and children's feet. But behind one door, someone had counted the wagons of a German train. Behind another, someone had saved bread. Behind another, a warning waited to be carried before dark. The quiet was full. The village network survived because ordinary people turned chores, glances, windows, and errands into a hidden language. That hidden language would soon carry news of a German train toward a room where a few people bent over an old map under covered lamplight. One wrong name in that room could send soldiers to the houses, the barns, and the forest paths before sunrise. The room was too small for what they were about to discuss. A wooden table stood near the centre, scratched by years of meals, mending, sorting, and ordinary hands that had once used it for ordinary work. Now an old map lay across it, held flat by a cup, a knife, and a piece of folded cloth. The lamp burned low. No one sat comfortably. A few people leaned forward with their elbows close to their bodies, as if even taking up space felt unsafe. The young woman stood near the edge of the table, her grey-blue headscarf pulled low, one hand resting on the map, while the other stayed close to her coat. She could feel the rough paper under her fingers. It felt too thin for so much danger. The map showed roads, rail lines, fields, a bridge, and the dark shape of the forest, drawn with marks that looked simple from above. On paper, a village became a dot. A railway became a clean line. A road became something that could be followed with the tip of a finger. Real life was never that clean. They spoke quietly, not because whispering made them safe, but because loud voices gave fear a shape. One man pointed to the rail line, then to the forest, then to the road that led back toward the village. Another shook his head before the finger had finished moving. The young woman watched their hands more than their faces. Hands sometimes told the truth first. Resistance groups often chose railways and supply routes because those were the places where German power could be slowed. They could not destroy the whole army from a small room in a poor village. They could not stop every column, every order, shipment, or every patrol. But a delayed train could matter. A damaged route could force repairs, guards, confusion, and wasted time. There was a bitter kind of sense in it, that people with almost nothing had to study railway timetables, while the army that occupied them rolled through the country with fuel, guards, and printed orders. The room held no grand command staff, no polished boots, no clean charts pinned to a wall. It held tired faces, rough sleeves, and people trying to make one decision without destroying everyone they loved. That was the weight on the table. They were not only speaking about a train, they were speaking about what might happen after the train failed to arrive, after soldiers came looking for names, after doors were kicked open, after someone was dragged into the road and asked who had helped. The map could not show that part. It had no mark for panic inside a mother's chest. It had no symbol for a barn set on fire. The young woman's eyes stopped on the village name written near the railroad. Her fingers tightened at the edge of the paper, and she had to loosen them before anyone noticed. That little name held houses, wells, fences, children, old women, hidden bread, and the road where German soldiers sometimes smoked. If the plan failed, the punishment might not fall only on those in the room. It might fall on everyone. No one said that plainly at first. They talked around it, through pauses and half-finished sentences. Someone mentioned patrols. Someone else mentioned which road had been watched. A woman near the door said nothing, but her jaw tightened when the village was named. Silence answered her. In a distant war room, a rail line might look like a target, but in this room, it ran past kitchens, barns, sleeping children, and people who would have no weapon in their hands when the punishment came. That was why the plan could not be only about striking. It had to be about leaving, hiding, warning, denying, and surviving the anger that would follow. The German train was one danger. The German search afterward was another. The young woman listened as each person gave only the piece they knew. One knew when the train usually passed. One knew which road the guards used. One knew where the forest path split after the wet ground. One knew which house could send a warning if soldiers moved before dawn. Nobody was allowed to know everything. Knowing too much could make a person dangerous if captured. That rule made the room feel colder. They trusted each other, but not enough to be careless. Trust under occupation was not warm and easy. It had limits, passwords, missing names, and faces that turned away before they revealed too much. A person could love the village and still be forbidden from knowing who carried the next message. That was how people stayed alive. The lamp flame moved slightly when someone shifted near the door. Everyone looked up at once. For 1 second, the room became still enough to hear breathing, cloth rubbing against a sleeve, and a boot scrapes softly under the table. Nothing happened outside. They lowered their eyes again. Fear did not stop the discussion. It only sat among them like another person. They continued because the trains continued. German supplies moved while villagers counted their bread, while men disappeared, while women learned to hide food under floorboards, and while children learned not to repeat what they heard. Doing nothing was also a choice. It had consequences, too. The hardest part was that nobody in the room could pretend the plan was clean, because every useful act of resistance pulled danger closer to people who had never touched a weapon. The young woman understood that, as she looked at the map. She had thought of the railway as a target from the bushes, But here the target had faces around it. It had neighbours attached. It had a price. When the discussion ended, there was no cheering. The map was folded carefully, the lamp was covered, and each person seemed to return to an ordinary shape before leaving. One became a neighbour walking home. One became a woman with a basket. One became a tired man stepping into the dark. The room emptied quietly. The young woman stayed a moment longer with her hand near the table. She could still see the rail line in her mind, and beside it the village name that had made everyone pause. She understood that the coming night would not be measured only by whether a German train was stopped. It would be measured by who was still alive afterward. That was the real plan. Inside that small room, the plan became more than a strike against a German train, because every line on the map led back to people who could be punished. Before she left, the young woman would receive something small enough to fit in her hand, something that looked weaker than any weapon. By morning, that little piece of food would feel heavier than the whole map, because it came from a mother who knew her daughter might bring death back to the village. Inside the small kitchen, the light was low and everything looked worn from years of use. A wooden table stood near the wall, rubbed smooth in the middle and rough along the edges where hands had worked, eaten, folded cloth, and counted what little food remained. A pot sat cold beside the stove, and a few dishes waited in the corner, like the house was still trying to behave normally. The young woman stood near the door in her dark coat, with dried mud along the lower edge of her skirt. Her hand rested close to the latch. She did not touch it yet. Her mother did not ask where she was going. She did not ask who would be waiting, which path she would take, or whether the forest was safe. Questions could make the danger too clear. And once danger became clear inside a kitchen, it was harder to keep breathing as if this were only another errand. So the older woman moved quietly toward the table. She reached for the bread. It was a small piece of black bread, hard around the edge and heavy in the middle. Food had become too precious for careless giving, and even a small piece meant something had been taken from another meal. Her mother laid it on a square of cloth and folded the corners with slow fingers, pressing each side flat as if the neatness could protect it. Her hands looked older under the weak lamp. The daughter noticed. Before the war, this gesture might have meant almost nothing. A mother giving bread to a daughter leaving home was part of village life, like warning her not to stay out after dark, or telling her to keep her boots away from deep mud. Bread went into baskets, pockets, and cloth bundles because people had fields to cross, chores to finish, and neighbours to visit. It was care made ordinary. Now it had weight. Her mother pushed the wrapped bread into her hand. For a moment, the young woman did not close her fingers around it. She looked at the cloth, then at the old hands that had folded it, and her thumb pressed softly against the hard edge beneath the fabric. The bread was smaller than a weapon and easier to hide than a map. It still made it harder for her to leave. War had a cruel way of turning the smallest kindness into something that could be used as evidence. A piece of bread could feed someone in the forest, but it could also condemn the person who gave it. A cloth bundle could look harmless until a soldier opened it, asked why it had been packed, and decided that care itself was a crime. In occupied villages, help did not need to be loud to be dangerous. It only needed to be found. Civilians often kept partisan groups alive in ways that looked small from a distance. They shared food, old coats, scraps of cloth for bandages, warnings from the road, and corners of barns where someone could sleep before moving again. They watched patrols, hid messages, and pretended not to know who had passed through after dark. Without those quiet acts, the people in the forest would have been hungry and easier to hunt. The village fought without saying so. The young woman closed her fingers around the bread at last. The cloth was rough against her palm, and the warmth from her mother's hands was already fading. She wanted to say something simple, maybe that she would come back before morning, but the words would have sounded too weak against what both of them understood. Her throat tightened. She stayed silent. Her mother reached up and straightened the edge of her scarf. The movement was quick and practical, the kind of gesture a mother might make before sending a daughter to fetch water or carry something to a neighbour. Yet, her fingers lingered near the girl's cheek for less than a second, and that was enough. She had no rifle, no guard post, and no safe way to protect her child. She had bread. In another life, this would have been a forgettable family moment, a mother fixing a scarf and a daughter trying not to look impatient. Here, the same gesture carried fear through the room. The young woman held still while the scarf was adjusted, shoulders tight under the coat, her muddy boots leaving faint marks on the floor. No one looked down at them. No one mentioned leaving. Guilt came quietly. She was not only taking bread out of the house, she was taking danger away with her and leaving danger behind as well, because if she was seen, followed, or named, the woman in this kitchen could pay for a mission she had never asked to hear described. That thought pressed harder than the bundle in her hand. It did not help to understand it. She slipped the bread into her coat and kept her palm over it for a moment. It was not only food now, it was proof that her mother knew enough to be afraid and still helped her leave. Outside waited the road, the watching windows, the German soldiers who might stand near the corner, and the forest paths that no longer belonged only to childhood. She lifted the latch. Her face had to change before the door opened. Softness could not go with her into the street, not where a nervous glance or one wrong step might be noticed. She lowered her shoulders, steadied her mouth, and made herself look like a village girl leaving for an ordinary task. The bread pressed against her coat as she breathed. It felt heavier than it was. The bread in her coat did not make the mission lighter, because it reminded her exactly who could suffer if she was seen. Once the door closed, every soft feeling had to be hidden under the plain face of a village girl going out for an ordinary errand. At the edge of the road, German eyes could turn toward her basket, her scarf, or one nervous step, and that single mistake could pull the whole village into danger. Leaving the kitchen was only the first part of the danger. Once the door closed behind her, the young woman had to become ordinary again, as if the bread in her coat and the fear in her chest belonged to someone else. She carried a small bundle of firewood against one arm and a cloth basket in the other hand, the kind any village girl might carry toward the forests. Her scarf sat low around her face. Nothing about her could look prepared. The road outside was grey in the late afternoon, with mud pressed flat by cart wheels and boots. Smoke drifted from a few chimneys, and the houses stood close together, quiet, in the way houses became quiet when people were watching from inside. She stepped away from the door without turning back too quickly. A normal girl did not look back like someone leaving a life behind. She kept walking. Her pace mattered more than any paper she could have carried. Too fast and she looked frightened. Too slow and she looked like someone trying too hard to be calm. She had to move with the tired rhythm of a girl sent to gather wood before dark, someone annoyed by cold weather and chores, not someone carrying a hidden purpose toward the trees. Her feet knew the road. Her face had to learn it again. Women in occupied villages often survived by using roles that soldiers thought they understood. A woman going to market, a girl carrying wood, a nurse with a bundle, a farm worker crossing a field, or an old woman with a basket could sometimes pass where a man would be searched. That did not make the work safe. It only made the disguise believable enough for one more street, one more corner, one more glance. Believable was survival. At the bend in the road, 2 German soldiers stood near a wall, smoking. One leaned with his shoulder against the wood, while the other looked down the street, as if boredom had made him careless. Their rifles were close enough to reach. The young woman felt her fingers tighten around the basket handle. She loosened them before the reeds creaked. The whole disguise rested on something as small as the way her hand held a basket. A real village girl would shift the weight when her wrist hurt. A frightened courier might grip it too tightly. A girl going for firewood would not stare at soldiers, but she would not avoid seeing them so sharply that her avoidance became visible. She looked once, then looked away. That was enough. People stood behind windows and half-open doors. An old man pretended to fix something near his gate, though his hands barely moved. A woman near a doorway held a child against her skirt and watched without lifting her chin. None of them could help her now without making things worse. Their silence followed her down the road. She adjusted the firewood against her arm. The bark scraped through her sleeve, and one thin branch pressed into the inside of her elbow. That small discomfort helped her because it gave her body something ordinary to answer. She could shift the bundle, breathe through her nose, and keep her mouth set in a tired line. A girl carrying wood might look uncomfortable. She should, in another kind of life. Acting normal might mean smiling through a bad day, but here, acting normal meant keeping German eyes away from the secret hidden under the shape of an errand. She had no uniform to betray her. She had no weapon visible at her side. Her cover was a basket, a scarf, muddy boots, and the slow patience of someone who had walked this road since childhood. The danger lived in the rhythm. One soldier said something to the other, and both laughed. She did not understand every word, but laughter from armed men could make the street feel smaller. Her shoulders wanted to rise. She forced them down and stepped around a puddle, because stepping through it too carelessly would splash her skirt, and stepping too carefully would show she was thinking too much. Even mud had rules. The soldiers did not stop her. One looked in her direction for a moment, long enough for her skin to tighten under the scarf. Then his gaze moved away, as if she were only another poor girl with chores. She kept walking at the same pace. Relief had to wait. The edge of the village came slowly. A fence leaned beside the last house, and beyond it the road thinned toward the fields. She wanted to reach the tree line quickly, but wanting was dangerous when it reached the legs. She made herself pause near a patch of loose wood, as if choosing whether any piece was worth taking. Her hand touched a branch. Her heart beat too hard. The painful skill she needed was not bravery, but self-control so ordinary that nobody would remember seeing it. She had to become part of the village road, part of the dull light, part of the daily movement of hunger and chores. The mission depended on people believing there was no mission. That was the trick. When the first trees came close, she did not hurry. She let the road carry her there as it had many times before. Only after the last house fell behind her did she shift the basket more firmly against her hip and breathe deeper. Even then, she did not look back for long. Someone might still be watching. Passing the village had not made her safe. It had only moved her into another kind of danger, one where the road ended and the forest began to keep its own record. Behind her were German eyes, neighbours' fear, and doors that could be kicked open if she failed. Ahead of her were wet leaves, soft mud, broken branches, and the chance that men with dogs had already entered the trees. The errand was over. She had left the village looking like a girl sent to gather firewood, and that plain face had carried her past German soldiers without breaking. But the road was only the first test, because the forest ahead did not forgive careless feet, snapped branches, or mud that held a clear print. In the trees, even a single footprint could become a trail for dogs, patrols, and men who knew exactly how to hunt partisans. Before we follow her beyond the last houses and into the wet forest, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe if you want more slow, human stories from wartime history. It helps the channel grow and keeps these forgotten lives from disappearing into silence. The forest received her without comfort. Wet leaves stuck to the soles of her boots, and each step had to be placed with care, because mud remembered more than people wanted it to. A branch brushed her shoulder, and she moved it aside with 2 fingers before setting it back exactly where it had been. 2 others waited beyond the first line of trees. One woman wore an old olive coat with the cuffs turned up, and a man beside her carried a small bundle under his arm. They did not greet her warmly, because warmth could become noise and noise could travel. A nod was enough. They moved deeper together. The path was not a real path anymore, only a line of memory through roots, wet leaves, low branches, and darker ground where too many feet would leave a warning. The young woman followed the person ahead of her, watching where his heel landed and where he avoided the mud. Her legs were tired from walking slowly through the village. Now they had to become careful in a different way. A few minutes later, Teda, one of the women, stopped and crouched near the ground. A boot print had formed clearly in the soft mud, with the heel and edge too easy to read. She took a pine branch and brushed across it slowly, not wiping it away in panic, but breaking the shape until it looked like weather damage. Everyone waited. The forest could hide them, but it could also betray them with the patience of wet earth. The village had soldiers, windows, roads, and neighbours who might look away too quickly. The forest had broken twigs, turned leaves, bent grass, and prints that could stay until morning. It did not choose sides, it only kept marks. Partisan groups often used forests, swamps, mountains, and remote places because these areas gave them cover from open roads and German patrols. Trucks could move fast on the main routes, but trees slowed men down, broke lines of sight, and made every search more difficult. That gave the partisans room to breathe, move, and disappear. It did not make them safe. Nazi's hunts could bring informers, patrol lines, and local guides forced or willing to lead soldiers toward hidden camps. A forest that saved someone at dusk could expose them by dawn if a footprint, a snapped branch, or smoke from a hidden fire gave the route away. The young woman understood this with every step. Safety was never complete, it was only borrowed. Her basket strap rubbed the sore place on her wrist. The bread in her coat pressed against her side when she bent under branches, and her boots made a low, sucking sound when the ground softened. She wanted to breathe deeply now that the village was behind her, but the trees did not allow relief. Somewhere far away, a dog barked. The group stopped. No one spoke. A man lifted one hand slightly, and the whole line froze among the trunks. The bark came again, distant but sharp, followed by a silence that seemed too long. It might have been a farm dog, it might have been a search dog. Guessing felt dangerous. The young woman's shoulder tightened under her coat. Her fingers curled around the basket handle, then slowly loosened so the reeds would not creak. She kept her mouth closed and her eyes lowered toward the ground where another step would need to be chosen. Fear wanted movement. Survival wanted stillness. They waited until the dog no longer sounded close. Then the group moved again, slower than before. One person stepped on exposed roots when possible. Another crossed over stones near a shallow stream, and the young woman followed with her skirt gathered lightly in one hand so it would not catch. Water soaked the edge of her boots. She did not complain. A person far from danger might imagine escape as simply running into trees. But for them, the trees were not an ending. They were left marks. Panic broke branches. Exhaustion, feet made careless. The forest protected only those who knew how easily it could accuse them. In the village, disguise had meant walking like a girl sent to gather wood. Here, disguise meant making the forest look untouched after they passed through it. A branch pushed aside had to be returned, a footprint blurred, a pause made under cover instead of open ground where several bodies could crush the leaves. The rules changed with the soil. They obeyed them. As the light faded, they reached a lower stretch of woods where the ground held more water. They did not cross straight through, because the mud there could take the shape of a boot and keep it clearly. They circled, though the longer route made her thighs ache and slowed everyone. The safest way was rarely the shortest. That was another lesson. A faint smell of smoke reached them. It was thin, almost lost under the smell of wet bark and soil, but every head lifted. Smoke could mean a house, a hidden camp, a careless fire, or soldiers nearby. One of the men listened, then pointed toward a darker line of trees. They followed without asking. The body learns this kind of fear quickly, not as a thought, but as a stiff neck, a tight jaw, and feet that stop before the mind has finished understanding why. The young woman noticed every small sound now: cloth brushing bark, a boot touching stone, a branch settling back into place. The forest seemed full of warnings. Some were real. By the time they reached the meeting place, night had settled properly. There was no fire, only a low shelter made from branches and a small space where people could crouch without being seen from a distance. Another partisan waited there, his face pale in the dark, one hand near his coat. He looked first at their boots, then at their faces. She understood that look. Arrival meant little if they had brought a trail behind them. They had passed the village, crossed wet ground, hidden prints, and stopped when the dog barked. But none of that proved they were safe. It only proved they had not been caught yet. That was different. The groups settled into the dark without relaxing. Someone checked the direction of the rail line. Someone listened to the lower road. The young woman crouched with her back near a damp trunk and rubbed one thumb over the mud on her sleeve. The forest had taken them in. It had not promised to keep them. The forest had hidden them for one more night, but every leaf, print and broken branch had forced them to move, as if the ground itself could report them. At the hidden meeting place, the danger would change from walking to waiting, because the German train had to arrive at the right hour, and the wrong train could ruin everything. Soon they would lie near the rails in the dark, listening to metal tremble under the earth, while one mistake could kill the wrong people and bring German search parties straight into the trees. Cold ground pressed against her stomach, and the damp worked through her coat, until it felt as if the forest had followed her all the way to the railway. The group lay low near the edge of the track, spread apart enough that one mistake would not expose everyone at once. No one spoke unless a whisper was necessary. Even breathing had to be managed. A man a few paces away looked at a pocket watch, shielding its face with one hand so the dull glint would not show. Another kept his eyes fixed on the curve where the line disappeared between trees and a dark field. The young woman lay with one cheek close to the earth, her fingers pressed into wet soil. The rails were still quiet. Waiting was different from walking. In the forests, each step gave the body something to do, even if that movement was slow and careful. Here, there was only stillness, and stillness made every thought louder. Her knees ached, her sleeves were damp, and the bread she had eaten earlier sat heavy in her stomach. She could not shift much. The cruel thing about waiting was that it gave fear time to become detailed. It was no longer just fear of Germans or dogs or gunfire. It became fear of the wrong train, the wrong hour, the wrong sound, the wrong shadow moving near the line. A small mistake could turn resistance into disaster. Nobody was allowed to make that mistake. Railway sabotage in wartime depended on timing, observation, escape routes, and coordination, not only courage. The people near the track had to know what they were seeing, when to act, when not to act, and how to leave without drawing every patrol toward them. In this story, the details do not need to become instructions. The danger is clear enough without them. They were not waiting for any train. That mattered. A wrong choice could waste the chance, expose the group, kill the wrong people, or bring punishment down before anything useful had been done. The young woman understood this while staring into the darkness that refused to explain itself. Every distant sound seemed important. Most of them were not. The pocket watch opened again. A thumb moved over its edge. The cover closed with a sound so soft it was almost imagined. The man holding it did not speak, but his jaw tightened. Someone farther down the line shifted one elbow, then stopped. The young woman felt mud squeeze between her fingers. She held the ground harder. In ordinary life, people wait for trains with impatience, counting minutes and thinking about where they need to be. But here waiting meant lying in mud and hoping the next light in the distance was the right kind of danger. Time did not pass normally. It thickened. Each minute felt handled too many times. A faint tremor touched the rail before any clear sound reached them. At first, she thought it might be her own pulse in the ground. Then it came again, a thin vibration under the dark, small enough that someone standing would miss it. She turned her eyes toward the curve. Still no light. The group grew even quieter. A person can be silent and then become more silent, and that was what happened among them. Shoulders lowered, mouths closed, heads flattened closer to the earth. The young woman's breath moved through her nose, slow and narrow. Her body wanted to lift and look. She did not let it. The first sound of metal came after the tremor. It was far away, light and uncertain, but it carried along the line with a meaning everyone understood. One person looked again toward the watch. Another made a small motion with 2 fingers, not enough to be seen from far away, but enough for those waiting to understand that the moment was approaching. Her throat tightened. What stayed with her was not bravery, but the effort of keeping her own body from becoming the loudest thing in the field. Her hand clenched the wet soil until dirt packed beneath her nails. Her foot started to cramp, and she forced herself not to move it. There was no room for comfort. Comfort belonged somewhere else. A pale light appeared at the bend. It did not burst into view at once. It grew slowly, first as a weak blur, then as a steady glow that touched the rails ahead of it. The engine was still far away, but the ground had already begun to change. The railway was waking. No one smiled. No one looked relieved. The approach of the train did not feel like success yet, only like responsibility becoming too close to avoid. The young woman watched the light and thought of the map on the table, the village name beside the line, the cloth bundle of bread, and her mother's hand near her scarf. Everything had followed her here. The glow widened. The sound grew heavier. Somewhere beyond that curve was the machine they had been waiting for, carrying whatever the German war had chosen to move through the night. Fear and anger moved together inside her now, not loudly, not cleanly, but with the cold certainty of something already begun. The waiting was ending. They had spent the night listening to the rails until every faint tremor felt like a warning. And now the right train was finally coming out of the dark. As it drew closer, the fear that had kept them still would have to turn into action without a single wasted second. The next moment would not be remembered by the sound alone, but by the terrible pause before the night burst open and no one could take the decision back. The train came through the curve with its headlamp cutting across the dark field, bright enough to make the rails shine for a few seconds before the engine reached them. Its wheels struck the metal with a hard, steady sound that filled the ground and entered the bodies of everyone lying low near the track. The young woman pressed herself behind a tree, her cheek close to the bark, her hands dug into cold soil. Nobody moved too early. The engine grew larger in the dark, smoke rolled above it, and the orange light from its firebox flickered over the wet stones beside the rails. The wagons followed in a long black line, heavy with whatever the German army needed to carry through the night. Ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, soldiers, orders, none of it had a face from where she lay. It still had weight. A strange quiet fell just before everything changed. The train was loud, the wheels were grinding, and the engine was breathing smoke into the field. Yet, inside the group, there was a silence so tight it felt separate from the noise. Her fingers closed around a handful of wet earth. Her mouth stayed shut. The whole night seemed to hold its breath. There was no clean glory in that second, only frightened people waiting for a violent choice to finish what they had already begun. The young woman did not feel like a legend. She felt the cold through her sleeves, the rough bark near her face, and the hard knowledge that the train was full of real weight and real consequences. The anger that had brought her here did not disappear. It simply became still. Then the night broke open. Light flashed across the track, too bright and sudden for her eyes to hold. A heavy sound tore through the darkness, followed by metal screaming against metal, wood cracking, and the deep shudder of something too large losing control. The ground jumped under her chest. A wave of heat and dust pushed through the trees. For a moment, no one understood the shape of what had happened. The engine's glow vanished behind smoke, then returned in pieces through the dark. One wagon leaned at a wrong angle, its side lit by fire. Another stood twisted behind it, half hidden in the rising smoke. The rail line no longer looked like a line. Partisans across occupied regions had attacked German railways because supply mattered as much as battlefield courage. A damaged train could delay ammunition, fuel, reinforcements, equipment, and food. It could force repairs, bring confusion, pull guards away from other duties, and make the occupation spend men and time protecting what it had once treated as routine. One strike did not win a war. It could still slow one down. The young woman did not cheer. No one near her did. Cheering belonged to stories told too far away from the smoke. Here, success was a thing that shook the ground, threw sparks into the field, and made every person suddenly aware that the Germans would come fast. The blow had landed. Now it would answer back. In a safer life, people might imagine victory as a clean moment of relief, but here victory smelled of smoke, hot metal, wet soil, and fear that punishment had already started moving toward the village. She saw the light flicker across her sleeve and the side of her hand. Her knuckles were scratched from the bark. Her breath came too quickly, and she forced it down. A shape moved near the track, then vanished behind smoke. Someone in the group made a low gesture, not a shout, because shouting could scare them into panic. The young woman pulled herself farther behind the tree and kept her head down. The task was not finished because the train had been hit. In some ways, the most dangerous part had just begun. The sound of the damaged train seemed to fill every direction. Metal settled with groans. Fire cracked short bursts. Somewhere beyond the smoke, men shouted, but the words were broken by distance and noise. A dog barked far away, or perhaps she imagined it because fear had already learned that sound. She could not tell. Her body wanted to look longer. It wanted proof that the mission had worked, proof that the long waiting, hidden bread, the covered lamp, the careful steps through the forest, and the fear in her mother's kitchen had led to something real. But looking too long could kill her. The fire gave enough light to expose faces. The smoke could hide them only briefly. The part that stayed in her was not triumph, but the shock of seeing an idea become wreckage in front of her eyes. On the map, the railway had been a line. In the room, the train had been a target. Here, beside the trees, it was burning metal, broken movement, and a danger too large to control once released. She understood why no one smiled. A man touched her sleeve and pointed toward the darker trees. The signal was small but urgent. She shifted backward, keeping low, feeling roots under one palm and mud sliding beneath her knee. The train still burned behind her. The forest ahead looked black and narrow. They began to withdraw without running straight. Each person moved toward a different angle, just as they had planned, because one line of footprints would be too easy to follow. The young woman's legs slowed, stiff from waiting and shock. Then the fear reached them properly. She moved. Behind her, the fire lit the track in waves. Ahead of her, the forest took away the light one branch at a time. The sound of shouting grew sharper, and somewhere along the line a whistle or alarm began to cut through the night. German soldiers would not need long to understand what had happened. The search would begin. The train had been struck, and the night had changed from waiting into smoke, fire, and a danger too large to celebrate. Now, the mission would become a race to disappear, before German patrols reached the trees, and before the village was pulled into the punishment. Behind them, the wreck still burned, but ahead of them, every wet footprint, broken branch, and panicked breath could lead the hunters straight to their backs. Running straight would have been the quickest way to die. The group did not pour into one path, or follow the same line back into the trees. One person cut toward the stream, another moved around the wet grass, and another disappeared behind a low bank where the firelight from the damaged train could not reach him. The young woman kept low as she moved. Her coat dragged against the damp weeds. Behind them, the wreck burned in broken flashes. The orange light rose and fell through the trees, making the trunks appear and vanish like something breathing in the dark. Metal still groaned near the track, and somewhere behind the smoke, men were shouting. Then, an alarm began to sound, thin at first, then sharper. The night had found its voice. The young woman held her small bag tight against her ribs. It was not heavy, but she carried it as if losing it would tear away the last piece of order she had left. Her boots slipped once in the wet grass, and one knee struck the ground hard enough to send pain up her leg. She did not stop to touch it. Stopping belonged to safer lives. No one was celebrating. The train had been hit, but that only meant the Germans now had a place to begin searching. Every road near the railway could be blocked. Every house near the line could be entered. Every villager who had looked too nervous during the day could become a question. Success had made the whole area dangerous. The cruel joke was that the moment they proved the Germans could be hurt, they also proved exactly where the Germans should start hunting. A failed mission could kill them quickly. A successful one could bring patrols, dogs, informers, and revenge into the forest and the village. The young woman understood that with every step away from the fire, the danger was wide. After acts of sabotage, German forces often searched nearby roads, villages, barns, forests, and crossings. They could use patrol lines, local informers, dogs, sudden checkpoints, and punishment meant to frighten civilians away from helping partisans again. The people who carried out the strike had to disappear before the first ring closed. The people left behind could not disappear so easily. The group kept separated, but not lost. They knew where the land dipped, where the stream turned, and where a fallen tree could mark the safer route without needing a spoken word. The young woman moved toward the darker part of the forest, away from the open track and the light behind her. Her breath came hard through her nose. She tried to keep it quiet. A branch caught the front of her coat. She pulled free too quickly, heard a faint snap, and froze for half a second. The sound seemed louder than it was, because fear made everything close. She reached back and pushed the broken twig downward into the wet leaves, though she knew it was a poor repair. Then she moved again. In ordinary fear, a person runs away from danger, but here running away created signs that danger could follow. A deep footprint, a bent reed, a snapped branch, a patch of crushed grass, even a smear of mud on bark could matter if men with dogs and lamps came after them. Escape was not a single movement. It was a long effort to leave as little proof as possible. Every mistake had a shape. The alarm behind them grew louder, joined by more voices near the rail line. The young woman could not see the soldiers yet, but that did not matter. She pictured them spreading out, angry, armed, pointing toward the forest, shouting orders, calling for dogs, sending men toward the road and the village at the same time. Her stomach tightened. She thought of the kitchen. Her mother would hear something before dawn. Maybe not the truth. Not at first, only the alarm, the trucks, the boots, the sudden knocking at doors. The bread in the young woman's coat was gone now, eaten earlier in the darkness, but its meaning had stayed with her. Someone had given her food, and someone could pay for that kindness. They reached the first deeper line of trees. A man ahead made a low hand signal, and the group split farther apart. One moved toward the stream to blur tracks in the water. Another circled through fir branches where the needles covered the ground. The young woman followed a path that was not a path, placing her feet where roots broke the mud. She was tired now. Her body wanted to become careless, and that was what scared her most. Shock had made her quick at first, but quickness faded. Her legs were heavy, her palms were scratched, and cold sweat dried under her scarf. She could feel the place where her knee had hit the ground. Pain tried to pull her attention downward. Behind her, the firelight weakened as the forest swallowed it. The alarm still reached them, but thinner now, broken by trees and distance. For one dangerous second, the distance felt like safety. She almost let herself breathe fully. Then a dog barked somewhere far behind, and the feeling vanished. The group did not stop at the first shelter. They passed it because any obvious hiding place near the route back could be searched early. They moved toward a place harder to reach, slower to find, and colder to wait in. The young woman understood the logic. She hated it anyway. By the time the train was only a glow behind the trees, the mission no longer felt like an attack. It felt like a chase that had started before the hunters were even visible. The forest gave them darkness, but not forgiveness. The ground still took prints. The branches still remembered touch. The dogs would come if the Germans brought them. The strike had worked, but escape turned the victory into a new kind of danger, one measured by wet grass, broken branches, and the first alarm rising behind them. As the partisans vanished deeper into the trees, the people who could not run were still inside the village, waiting for the sound of German trucks. By morning, doors would be kicked open, families dragged outside, and the mother who gave bread would have to stand still while soldiers searched for the price of one burning train. Morning came to the village before safety did. The sky was pale, the road was wet, and the houses looked tired in the grey light, but nobody mistook the quiet for peace. News had already moved faster than people dared to speak. A German train had been struck in the night. The first trucks arrived before many doors were fully open. Their engines sounded too heavy for the narrow road, and mud jumped beneath their wheels as they stopped near the square. Soldiers climbed down with hard faces, rifles in hand, looking not only at houses but at windows, fences, barns, and every person who might have known something. The village seemed to shrink around them. Nobody stepped forward. A door was struck with the butt of a rifle, then another. A woman pulled a child behind her skirt. An old man raised his hands before anyone asked him to, and a boy carrying a bucket froze in the middle of the road. The mother who had wrapped the bread stood near her doorway for 1 second too long, then she moved with the others. They were gathered near the churchyard where the mud had been pressed flat by many feet. Men, women, children and old people stood in rough lines while soldiers moved through houses behind them. The mother kept her face still, one hand closed around a small piece of cloth in her pocket. It was not the same cloth. It did not matter. This was the part of resistance that never looked clean, because the people who stayed behind often met the anger before the people who struck the blow were even found. The train had burned near the forest, but the punishment came to kitchens, barns, beds, and doorways. Soldiers did not need proof at first. Suspicion was enough to begin. German anti-partisan actions in occupied areas often struck beyond the fighters themselves. Searches, hostage-taking, beatings, burned homes, forced questioning, and collective punishment could fall while helping resistance groups. The purpose was not only to find resistance groups. It was to make help feel too partisans. One soldier shouted questions in the square. Another walked along the line of villagers, looking at faces as if guilt could be seen in eyelids, hands, or the way someone swallowed. The mother stared forward and did not look toward the forest. She knew her daughter might be there. She also knew that one glance in that direction could become a sentence. Inside the houses, drawers were pulled open, blankets thrown aside, and floorboards struck with boots. A hidden crust of bread, an old coat, or a scrap of cloth could suddenly feel dangerous. Even ordinary poverty looked suspicious when soldiers wanted a reason. A woman cried when they overturned a box of family things. Nobody comforted her. In a peaceful life, a search means inconvenience and anger, but here, a hand opening a cupboard could decide whether a family slept at home that night or disappeared into a truck. That was why silence spread so quickly through the line. People did not only fear being caught lying, they feared being caught caring, feeding, warning, or remembering the wrong name. The village heard about the train before it heard who had been taken. That made the morning worse. Every person stood inside a gap between rumour and loss, waiting for the news to become personal. A damaged train was distant, even if it had happened nearby. A neighbour pulled from the line was not distant. That was when war entered the body. The mother's fingers tightened around the cloth in her pocket. Her face did not change, Her shoulders did not rise. She had spent years learning how to stand through hunger, bad harvests, grief, and German orders, but this required another kind of stillness. She had to look like a woman who knew nothing. A soldier stopped in front of her. He said something sharp, and she lowered her eyes just enough to seem frightened, not enough to seem guilty. Her hands stayed still. For a second, she could feel the memory of the bread in her palms, the pressure of folding cloth, the warmth of her daughter's hand when the bundle passed between them. Then the soldier moved on. The cruelest thing was that love had to leave no trace. A mother could not look relieved. She could not look proud. She could not look toward the trees. She had to stand among neighbours with an empty face while the morning searched for proof of what she had done. By mid-morning, several people had been questioned apart from the line. One man returned with his lip bleeding. Another did not at once. A barn door hung open after soldiers finished searching it, and chicken scattered through the mud, as if the village itself had lost its ordinary shape. The train had been struck once. The village was being struck slowly. In the forest, the partisans could not see all of this, but they could imagine enough. That was part of the burden they carried after every action. To run back would be madness. To send a message too quickly might expose a path. To do nothing felt like betrayal, even when doing nothing was the only way to keep more people alive. The mother did not look toward the forests when the trucks finally moved again. She watched the road, the soldiers, the muddy wheels, and the faces around her. Only after they were gone did her hand come out of her pocket. The cloth was twisted tight between her fingers. The village learned that morning that a burning German train could send its first flames into houses that had never touched the railway. In the forest, the young woman and the others would hear pieces of what had happened, but they would not be able to return without leading the hunt straight to their hiding place. Soon she would lie under leaves and mud, while dogs passed close enough for her to feel the ground tremble beside her face. She lay in a shallow pit covered with dry leaves, though nothing about it felt dry anymore. Mud had soaked through her sleeve, cold water pressed against her ribs, and a line of ants moved across the side of her neck, as if her body were only another piece of forest floor. Leaves covered her back, her hair, and part of her face. She did not move. Above her, the forest was no longer shelter. It had become a place being examined by boots, dogs, and men who knew that someone had vanished into it after the train burned. Branches snapped in the distance, then closer again. A German voice cut through the trees, sharp and short. Her fingers curled into the mud. The search party moved slowly. That was worse than running men, because slow men had time to look. They checked hollows, pushed through brush, stopped near fallen trunks, and let the dogs pull toward places human eyes might miss. The young woman could hear the leather of a leash creak somewhere above the leaves. Then came the breathing. The dog was close enough for her to hear its nose working through the air. It snorted, paused, and dragged its paws through the leaves near the edge of the pit. Her chest tightened so hard that breathing became a task with rules. She had to take air without sound, without shaking the leaves, without letting panic climb into her throat. Survival became tiny. The body was suddenly more dangerous than any weapon, because a cough, a flinch, or one sharp breath could betray what the forest had hidden. She could not fight from that pit. She could not run without bringing rifles down on her back. She could not beg, speak, or explain. She could only be still. German anti-partisan hunts often used patrols, dogs, informers, local guides, and searchlines moving through forests or villages suspected of sheltering fighters. The purpose was to find the people who had attacked roads, railways, and supply lines, but also to frighten anyone who might help them again. A hidden camp, a food trail, or one careless footprint could bring armed men into a place that had felt safe the day before. The forest could be surrounded. A boot stopped near the pit. She saw it through a crack between leaves, dark leather, mud on the sole, the toe angled toward her face. The dog pulled closer, and the ground trembled unfaintly when it shifted its weight. She could smell wet fur, salts, and the sharp stink of fear rising from her own clothes. Her teeth pressed together. She thought of the village then, not in a long memory, but in flashes. Her mind could not stop. Her mother was folding bread, the table in the dim kitchen, the muddy road where soldiers had smoked, the old basket handle pressed into her palm. All of it seemed impossibly far away. The boot was here. In ordinary life, staying quiet might mean politeness, patience, or not waking someone in the next room, but here silence had to hold an entire life inside one closed mouth. Her throat burned because she needed to swallow. A small insect crawled under the edge of her scarf. Mud crept colder through the cloth at her elbow. She did not lift a finger. The dog sniffed again. One soldier said something and answered from farther away. The words meant less than the tone. They were not relaxed, but they were not certain either. Uncertainty was the thin space she lived inside. If the dog pulled harder, if the soldier looked down longer, if one leaf moved against her cheek, that space would close. Her lungs wanted more air. She let it in slowly, through her nose, counting without numbers, making each breath smaller than the last. A leaf stuck to her lower lip. She could feel a cough waiting somewhere deep in her chest, born from damp, smoke, cold, and fear. She pushed it down until pain spread beneath her ribs. No story of resistance should skip this kind of moment, because courage here was not loud at all. It was a frightened woman forcing her own body to stay buried while death stood beside her. The train, the map, the fire, the escape, all of it had led to this simple test. Could she remain less alive than the leaves above her? Could she become ground? The boot shifted. The dog turned its head, sniffed once toward another patch of brush, and pulled away. Leaves crackled as the handler followed. The sound moved past her, then slowed again, then faded by a few steps that felt longer than a road. She still did not move. Relief could be noisy too. Minutes passed without shape. The search party continued through the trees, and every distant snap made her body tighten again. She waited until the voices had thinned, until the dog no longer sounded close, until even the forest seemed afraid to return to itself. Only then did she let her fingers loosen in the mud. Her whole arm ached. She was alive, but safety did not arrive with that thought. The pit smelled of damp leaves and cold dirt, and her clothes clung to her skin. When she finally lifted her face a little, a few leaves slid from her hair onto her sleeve. She looked through the gap where the boots had stood. Empty ground could still feel occupied. She had survived the search, not by outrunning it, but by lying under leaves while a dog breathed close enough to shake the dirt beside her face. Yet escaping the patrol did not mean the forest had become kind, because the next danger would come more slowly. Through hunger, cold, wet clothing, and the space left by those who did not return. Back at the hidden camp, victory would taste like old bread, covered in smoke, and one place beside the trees that nobody wanted to name. Back at the forest shelter, nobody spoke of victory first. A small piece of black bread was placed on a flat stone, then divided with a knife into portions too thin to satisfy anyone. The fire had been built low and covered at the sides with earth, so the smoke would not rise cleanly through the trees. In the dim light, Their faces looked older than they had the night before. The young woman sat with her back against a damp trunk, her coat still wet from the pit where she had hidden. Mud had dried along her sleeve, and bits of leaf clung to her hair near one ear. Her hands shook slightly when she took a piece of bread, though the shaking was no longer from cold alone. She held it for a moment before eating. There was no hurry. A man near the fire broke his portion in half, then stopped with one piece still between his fingers. Beside a thick root, there was a space where someone usually sat. No one looked at it directly. No one said the missing person's name. The extra motion of his hand told enough. A successful mission should have brought celebration, but in that shelter, success looked like old bread, wet sleeves, and a place beside the tree that everyone avoided with their eyes. The train had been hit. The rail line had been disrupted. The German war machine had been slowed for a little while. Still, nobody had a meal large enough to call a feast. Nobody felt clean enough to call it a triumph. Partisan camps in forests were rarely comfortable places. Food had to be carried, stolen, shared, or received from villagers who risked punishment for every loaf. Medicine was short, dry clothes were precious, and fires had to be small enough not to send smoke above the trees. A shelter could save people one night and endanger them the next if tracks, ash, or supply routes led patrols toward it. Survival was careful poverty. The young woman chewed slowly. The bread was hard and sour, and each bite scratched at her dry throat. She thought of the piece her mother had wrapped, then of the village square, though she had not seen it with her own eyes. She could imagine enough. Someone fed a few twigs into the hidden fire and pressed earth around the edge again. The flame gave almost no warmth unless a person leaned close. And even then, it warmed only the hands, not the damp cloth against the back or the cold inside the boots. The smoke crawled low and dirty, caught under branches before thinning out. They watched it as if it were another enemy. Smoke could talk. In an ordinary camp, smoke means warmth, food, and rest. But here, smoke could become a finger pointing straight down at them from the sky. They could not simply build a proper fire and dry their clothes. They could not cook enough food to make the air smell human. They could not laugh too loudly or sleep too deeply. Even rest had to be hidden. One of the older partisans asked how many had reached the shelter. The answer came in pieces, not as a clear report. One had gone toward the stream. Another had not arrived. A third might still be circling back by the long route, unless the dogs had crossed the lower ground. Nobody wanted to finish the sentence. The forest finished it for them with instant. The young woman looked at the empty place beside the route again, then looked away too quickly. Her fingers pressed crumbs into her palm. She had no proof of what had happened to the missing person. That made the absence worse because hope and fear both tried to sit in the same space. Neither belonged comfortably there. The mission had worked, but it had not lifted anything from them. Instead, it placed new weight on their shoulders. They had struck a train, survived the first search, and returned with fewer people than they wanted to count. The village might already be paying. Their own camp might be bound before nightfall. Success had not ended danger, it had multiplied it. The hardest truth in that shelter was that the train could be damaged, and the people who damaged it could still feel smaller, colder, and less certain than before. The young woman had imagined before the strike that action might make fear simpler. It did not. It gave fear new names, new faces, and one empty place near the tree. They ate without speaking much. A strip of cloth was passed to someone with a scraped arm. A wet boot was pulled off, checked, and put back on because there was no dry pair waiting. One person leaned against a trunk and closed his eyes for less than a minute before opening them again. Sleep was dangerous when the forest was being searched. Late in the night, a messenger reached the shelter. His coat was smeared with mud, and his breathing came rough from moving through the long route. He did not give all the news at once. He drank a mouthful of water first, then looked toward the small fire, then toward the faces waiting in the dark. The young woman knew from his pause that the news would not be clean. He spoke of the village in fragments. Trucks had come, houses had been searched, people had been lined up near the churchyard. Some had been questioned. Maybe more would follow. The words entered the shelter slowly, and nobody interrupted them. The bread in her stomach turned heavy. No one asked aloud whether the train had been worth it. The question did not need a voice. It moved through the group in the way one man lowered his head, the way a woman stared at the fire, and the way the young woman rubbed mud from her sleeve until the cloth began to fray. Outside, the forest stayed dark. Inside, nobody was free of the village. They had returned to the shelter alive, but victory tasted of the bread, hidden smoke, and the silence left by someone who had not come back. The news from the village would force them to face a question more dangerous than the patrols still moving through the woods. Soon, no one would dare ask whether the burning train was worth the doors kicked open, the people taken away, and the mother standing in the square with no place to put her fear. The messenger returned near the edge of night, when the small shelter had become quiet in the tired way that comes after fear has used up most of the body. He stood at the entrance with mud on his coat, one hand against the branch frame, and his breath still uneven from the long route through the trees. Nobody asked him to speak faster. They could already see enough from his face. He said that people had been taken from the village. Not everyone, not yet, but enough for the shelter to change. A man near the covered fire stood up and walked outside without taking his coat. Another looked down at the knife in his hand and kept turning it slowly, though there was nothing left to cut. The young woman stared at the piece of bread she had not finished. No one asked whether the train had been worth it. The words would have been too large for that small space, and too cruel for people who were still wet, hungry, and hunted. But the question settled among them anyway. It sat on the map, on the bread, on the damp coats, and on the place where one missing fighter should have been sitting. Nobody escaped it. They had struck a German train because trains carried the occupation forward. They had slowed movement, damaged supply, and forced the enemy to spend time and men repairing what had been broken. None of that was false. The military reason remained clear even inside the shelter, but clarity did not make the cost disappear. The cruel part was that the train belonged to the occupiers, while the first hands grabbed in anger often belonged to villagers who had no rifle at all. That was the shape of guerrilla war under occupation. A strike could hurt a military system, but retaliation could fall on houses, barns, mothers, children, and old men who only knew how to survive quietly. Everyone in the shelter understood this. That was why no one spoke easily. The young woman kept her eyes on the bread. Its dark crust had cracked where her fingers had pressed too hard. She thought of her mother standing in the village square with a blank face, not looking toward the forest, not showing that she knew anything. That thought made the shelter feel smaller. Her shoulders tightened under the wet coat. Someone finally asked how many had been taken. The messenger did not answer at once. He looked toward the covered fire, then toward the entrance behind him, as if the trees might be listening too. He gave the number quietly. It was not the worst number they could have imagined. That did not make it merciful. A woman near the back covered her mouth with 2 fingers, then dropped her hand quickly, as if even grief needed discipline. The man with the knife stopped turning it. Outside, the one who had walked away remained in the dark, close enough for them to hear one branch shift under his boot. Nobody called him back. Some silences had to be left alone. In another kind of story, this would be the place where people speak brave lines and prove their certainty. But real people often sit with doubt, because doubt is what remains when both choices can destroy someone. If they did nothing, German trains would keep moving. If they acted, villagers could bleed for it. There was no clean place to stand, only the ground that shifted. The messenger added more details in pieces. Houses had been searched again. A barn had been opened. One old man had been questioned because someone said he had been near the road at the wrong hour. A woman had been struck for refusing to answer quickly enough. Each sentence landed without drama. That made it worse. The young woman's hand moved toward her coat, where the bread from her mother had once been hidden. It was gone now, eaten before the strike, but her body still remembered its weight. She remembered the cloth, the kitchen, the way her mother's fingers had straightened her scarf. That small tenderness had not made her safer. It had tied her more tightly to everyone who could now be punished. No one in the shelter blamed the missing mother, or the old woman with the window cloth, or the boy who had crossed the market. They blamed the Germans. They blamed the war. They blamed the machine that made ordinary help dangerous, and then punished people for giving it. But blame did not open the prison door. It did not strike a face. It did not bring the taken people home. The hardest thing to carry was not only fear of death, but the knowledge that their courage could place danger in another person's doorway. The young woman lifted the bread at last, then set it down again. She was hungry. She could not swallow. Across from her, someone folded the map without looking at the rail line. The room stayed too quiet. At length, the older partisan spoke. Not loudly, not like a leader in a speech, but like a tired man making the only hard statement left. They could not undo the strike. They could not walk back into the village and rescue everyone without leading the Germans straight to the forest camp. They could only change what came next. Routes had to move, signs had to change, names had to be used less. That was not comfort, it was work. The young woman understood then that guilt would not be allowed to sit still for long. It would be turned into caution, into discipline, into fewer words, fewer repeated paths, and colder decisions. The village had suffered, and the forest could suffer next if they were careless. Grief had to become a method. No one liked that truth. The covered fire sank lower, and the shelter darkened around them. Outside, the forest held its breath in the cold. The messenger finally sat down with his back against a trunk to keep standing. Nobody asked the question aloud. Everyone had already heard it. They had damaged a German train, but the silence in the shelter showed that the price had reached people who never stood beside the track. Since they could not undo the arrests or walk openly back into the village, survival now had to become stricter, colder, and less forgiving. Before dawn, they would bury ashes, burn scraps of paper, erase old marks from trees, and abandon the very camp that had kept them alive. Before we follow them into another cold morning in the forest, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe if you want more slow, human stories from wartime history. It helps the channel grow, and it keeps these forgotten lives from being lost beneath the louder parts of war. Before dawn, the camp began to disappear. No one announced it as a retreat, and no one stood long enough to treat it like a farewell. The small fire was killed with earth, not water, because steam and smell could linger in the cold air and tell a search party where people had been. Ashes were pressed flat under mud and leaves. A tin can was pulled from beside a root and buried deeper than a careless search might reach. A strip of cloth that had tied a branch into place was cut loose, rolled once around a finger, and pushed into wet soil. A scrap of paper was burned until it curled black, then crushed between two stones. Every small thing mattered. The young woman moved with her bag over one shoulder, her sleeves still damp from the night before. Her hands were cold, but they kept working because stopping to feel cold had become another kind of weakness. She gathered crumbs from a flat stone, scattered leaves over the sleeping places, and checked where her boots had pressed too clearly near the shelter. The forest had to forget them. The place that had kept them alive yesterday could kill them tomorrow if it still looked loved, used, or trusted. The shelter had given them cover, a little warmth, a place to divide bread, and enough darkness to breathe after the search. But after the train, after the village was punished, after patrols began moving through the woods, the same shelter could become a trap. Safety had become temporary. Partisan groups often had to change camps, routes, passwords, supply paths, and warning signs after major actions. A repeated trail could be followed, a familiar mark could be noticed, and a villager bringing food by the same road could be watched the next time. Even a good hiding place became dangerous if too many people remembered how to reach it. Survival depended on leaving first. They worked before the first grey light could expose the ground. One man checked the edge of the old sleeping place and kicked damp leaves over it with the side of his boot. Another erased a scrape where bark had bent from a root. The young woman reached toward a tree where a small knife mark had once helped her find the camp in darkness. Her hand stopped. For several nights, that cut in the bark had meant she was close to people who understood the same danger. It had meant a low fire, a piece of bread, a whispered report, and a place where she could lower her shoulders for a few minutes. Now it had to mean nothing. She pulled her hand back. Memory had to obey. The old route out was not used. The shortest way stayed behind them, along with the drier path and the easier slope. Those were exactly the kinds of routes tired people used twice, and using anything twice could create a pattern. They moved toward lower ground first, then turned through thicker trees where each step was slower. Tired bodies wanted mercy, the forest offered none. A password was changed before they separated. It was spoken once, softly, and not repeated for anyone who had not heard it clearly. One messenger was told to avoid the barn route. Another was told not to use the woman with the blue shutters for several days. The young woman listened without asking for more than she needed. Knowing less could save others. That rule felt colder after the village search. Nobody wanted to imagine being caught, but everyone had to plan as if fear, pain, or threats against family might break even a strong person. So, names were reduced, routes split, and old signs destroyed before habit could betray them. Trust remained, but it was cut into smaller pieces. That was how it survived. Her fingers hovered near the marked tree again, then closed around the strap of her bag instead, because even touching a familiar place could make leaving it harder. She wanted one last look at the shelter, at the covered fire, at the space near the root where the missing person had not returned. She allowed herself only a glance. A long goodbye could slow the feet. By the time pale light reached the higher branches, the camp had almost vanished. Not perfectly, because nothing done in fear was perfect, but enough that a passing patrol might see only wet leaves, low brush, and the ordinary disorder of the woods. The people who had slept there were already moving in separate lines. Their absence had to be careful too. Changing the camp did not remove the deeper fear. Someone in the region might have spoken. Someone might have been forced to speak. Someone might have seen a face, a path, a basket, a cloth, or a meeting place, and given away only one detail. A forest could be opened by a single clue. One clue was enough. The young woman adjusted the strap on her shoulder and stepped over a root without touching the marked tree again. Behind her, the old shelter faded into branches and damp leaves. Ahead, another hiding place waited, colder, less familiar, and not yet trusted. She did not want to go there. She went anyway. They erased the old camp before dawn because survival meant treating yesterday's shelter as tomorrow's danger. But new routes, new signs, and new passwords could not erase the fear that someone nearby might have already talked. Soon, one missing signal and one delayed messenger would make the whole group wonder whether the path into the forest had been sold to the Germans. The first sign was the absence of a sign. A branch that should have been turned toward the stream was still lying the old way, flat against the wet leaves, as if nobody had touched it. Stun stopped near the grey edge of the forest and looked at it without bending down. Her face did not change. The messenger arrived late, not a little late, not the kind of late caused by mud, darkness, or an old patrol on the road, but late enough that everyone standing under the trees understood the difference. His coat was wet at the shoulders, and one side of his face looked pale from cold or fear. He did not speak at once. That made it worse. When he finally gave the name, he said it as quietly that the forest seemed to lean closer. Nobody repeated it. A man near the trunk looked toward the ground. A woman tightened both hands around the strap of her bag, and the young woman felt her jaw lock before she could soften it. The name hung there without being confirmed. It did not need to be. A traitor did not need to know the whole network to destroy it, because one path into the forest could be enough. One route could lead soldiers toward a shelter. One meeting place could lead to a messenger. One messenger could lead to a house, a barn, a mother, or a boy who had once crossed the market with salt. The danger no longer came only from German patrols outside the village. It could come through a familiar face. Partisan networks were often threatened by informers, infiltration, fear, torture, pressure on families, and local collaborators who gave up routes or names. Some people betrayed for a reward. Some betrayed because they were threatened. Some were broken by interrogation, hunger, or the sight of their own family being dragged into danger. The result could be the same. A hidden path became visible. The young woman looked at the old trail ahead of them. It curved between low branches, past a dark patch of fir trees, and dropped toward the wetter ground before turning deeper into the woods. She had walked it before. She had trusted its bends, its mud, its cover. Now, the path looked different, not because it had changed, but because someone else might know it. That was enough. A few people began speaking less than usual after that, not in a dramatic way. They simply stopped using names when a nod would do. They shortened reports, changed the order of words, and avoided saying where anyone would sleep after dark. The young woman noticed how quickly trust could shrink. It did not vanish, it tightened. The forest felt colder when they realized secrecy might already have been opened from the inside. A broken branch could be hidden, a footprint blurred, a camp abandoned before dawn. But a spoken name could not be pulled back once it had reached the wrong ears. No one knew how far it had travelled. That uncertainty worked like frost. The messenger explained what he knew in pieces. A safe sign had failed to appear near the lower road. A man who usually carried warnings had not reached the meeting place. Someone had been seen speaking near the German post, though nobody could say whether it was choice, pressure, or fear. Each detail was small. Together they formed a shape nobody wanted to name. The young woman's fingers moved to the strap of her bag and stayed there. She thought of the village again, of old women near windows, of doors closing early, of children pretending errands had no meaning. All of that had depended on the belief that enough people would stay silent. Now, silence itself felt injured. The ground under her boots seemed less steady. They could not accuse loudly. Loud accusations could split the group faster than any patrol. They could not ignore the warning either. Ignoring it would be a gift to the Germans if the path had truly been sold. So they did what frightened people with discipline had to do. They made the network smaller. One route was abandoned immediately. A meeting place was closed without farewell. A message that should have gone through 3 hands would now go through 1, and only if the road looked clear by dusk. Real names were used less. Familiar paths became suspicious. The young woman watched the forest line and felt how lonely survival was becoming. Her face hardened when she looked down the path, not from bravery, but from the ugly knowledge that fear could make even a neighbour's footsteps sound dangerous. She did not want to think of anyone from the village giving the route away. She also knew that wanting was useless. War did not protect people from the thoughts they hated. It forced them to plan around them. By evening, the group had begun to divide. 2 would move toward the stream, 1 toward the old charcoal pit, and another would wait near the ridge only long enough to watch the road. Nobody was told everything. Nobody asked to be. The young woman received her direction and repeated only the part she needed to know. Her voice stayed low. The forest did not feel like a shelter now. It felt like a room with 1 wall missing. Every old sign seemed too obvious, every trail too clean, every delayed messenger too heavy with meaning. Somewhere beyond the trees, German patrols might already be waiting for the forest to betray its own people. She stepped away from the group without looking back too long. That was safer. The missing sign and the late messenger had changed the forest more than any storm, because now every familiar path could be a road already known to the enemy, since once one informer needed only a single route to endanger everyone. The group would break itself into smaller pieces and survive with less trust than before. Before the next fire burned low, knowing too little would become a way to protect others, but it would also leave each person more alone in the dark. The password changed before the fire was properly covered. One woman spoke Amidst, low enough that the trees seemed to swallow half the sound, and no one asked her to repeat it. A real name was left unused beside the small flame, as if it had become too dangerous to carry in the open. The young woman listened, nodded, and kept her hands near her knees. That was all. A folded map lay between them, then disappeared into a coat before anyone could study it too long. A burned scrap of paper curled inside a tin bowl, black at the edges and grey in the middle. Across the fire, another young woman sat with her sleeves pulled over her wrists, staring into the low light without asking where the next route ended. Her face looked calm. Her fingers did not. This was how the group made itself harder to break. One person knew the first path. Another knew the second meeting place. A third knew which house might offer food, but not who would carry the message after that. Nobody was meant to hold the whole shape in their mind. A captured person could not give away what they had never been told. Partisan and resistance networks often survived by dividing information into small pieces. They used false names, changing passwords, separate cells, hidden signals, and limits on who knew which route or contact. It could feel cold, But it was not done because people lacked trust. It was done because trust alone could not survive dogs, prisons, threats, and pain. Secrecy had to do the work that affection could not. The cruel protection was that a friend became safer when you knew less about her. You could sit beside someone, share bread, warm your hands near the same small fire, and still not ask where her family lived. You could learn the shape of her cough, the way she tied her scarf, and how she held a cup when she was tired. Her real name might remain untouched, that was Mercy. Had once thought, knowing people meant asking about their homes, their brothers, their mothers, and the small details that made a person more than a face. In the village, names carried warmth. A surname could bring a story, a field, a wedding, a quarrel, or a memory from childhood. Here, names carried danger. A name could travel farther than a bullet. She looked across the fire at the other girl and wondered how old she was. Not very old, maybe close to her own age, but war made age difficult to read. Mud, fear, hunger, and sleeplessness put years on a face before the body had earned them. The other girl pulled one knee closer to her chest and stared down at the folded edge of her coat. Neither of them asked anything personal. A small piece of bread was passed around, and each person took less than they wanted. The young woman brushed another hand in the dark, but both pulled back quickly, not from dislike, only from the habit of limiting every softness before it could become a question. The fire was too small to warm them properly. It was large enough to show their faces. That already felt risky. Around that fire, silence was not emptiness. It was a wall built to keep soldiers from reaching the people they loved. A laugh might invite a question. A question might invite a name. A name might open a road back to a village, a mother, a brother, or a cellar where someone was hiding. So the group spoke of routes, weather, signals, and patrols. They left their hearts unnamed. The young woman received her next instruction in only a few words. She was told which direction to take at first light, where to stop if the lower road was watched, and what sign meant the path had closed. She was not told who would meet her beyond that sign. She wanted to ask. Because not knowing made the road feel longer, she did not ask. That was the new discipline. Curiosity had to be treated like hunger, something real but not always safe to feed. Each person carried only enough knowledge to finish the next task. Anything more could become a weapon in German hands if the wrong person were caught. The idea was simple. Living with it was not. Night settled deeper around the trees. The folded map was gone. The paper in the tin bowl had become ash, and the password sat in her mind like a small stone she must not drop. Across from her, the other girl finally lifted her eyes. For one brief moment, they looked at each other like two ordinary young women who might have been from a different life. Then both looked away. The ache of that moment stayed in the way their eyes moved, because they wanted to trust each other like sisters, but had to protect each other like strangers. Nobody had to explain the rule again. The forest had already explained it. The Germans had explained it. The missing sign and the late messengers had explained it better than any speech. Before dawn, they separated into smaller groups. One went toward the stream, one toward the ridge, and the young woman took the line of trees that bent away from the old route. The fire was covered before the last person left, and the tin bowl was turned upside down over the ash. The camp looked almost empty. It was not empty enough. She walked with less knowledge than before, and that should have made her safer. Instead, it made every sound feel larger. She did not know who was waiting ahead. She did not know who had already moved. She did not know which name had been left behind forever, because nobody dared say it aloud. Safety had made her lonely. They survived by cutting knowledge into small pieces, so no one person could betray the whole road if captured. But the same rule that protected the group also made the forest colder, because friendship had to stop at the edge of a real name. By the next night, that loneliness would become heavier when an injured comrade slowed the escape, and the group had to decide whether saving one person might condemn them all. Mud made every step slower. It pulled at boots, held the edges of coats, and turned the narrow forest route into a place where tired bodies had to fight the ground as much as the men behind them. The group moved without a clean line, bending between wet trunks and low branches, while distant dog barks came through the dark in broken pieces. One girl was not moving fast enough. She had been hit in the leg during the last burst of panic near the lower trees. The wound was wrapped in grey cloth, but the bandage had darkened, and each step made her breath catch behind closed teeth. Two others held her under the arms and half carried her through the mud. Her boots dragged more than they stepped. The dogs sounded closer. No one said the obvious thing. The group could move faster without her. Every person knew it, including the injured girl. She tried to pull one arm free, not with strength, but with the weak stubbornness of someone who understood what her body was doing to everyone else. The woman beside her tightened her grip and kept walking. The answer was not spoken. Cruel decisions in the forest did not always come from hatred, because sometimes they came from trying to save someone without killing everyone else. A wounded fighter could slow the group enough for a patrol to catch them. A stretcher was too heavy, a doctor too far away, and proper medicine almost impossible to find. Yet leaving a person behind was not simply a practical choice. It could break something inside the living. Partisan groups often lacked what regular armies took for granted. They had few medical supplies, few clean bandages, no safe hospital nearby, and no easy way to carry the wounded while being hunted. Forest camps might hide people, but they did not heal them quickly. A wound could become fever, a burden, a trail, or a reason for the whole group to be found. Survival turned human care into a problem. The young woman moved beside them, with one hand ready to catch the injured girl if her knee failed. Mud had splashed up to her own thighs, and her fingers were scratched from branches. She could hear the wounded girl's breathing, shallow and controlled, as if pain had to be kept quiet too. A cry could travel. Even suffering needed discipline. A beam of light moved far behind them between the trees. It was brief, then gone, then brief again, cutting through trunks and wet leaves like a pale blade. The group lowered at once. The injured girl's foot slipped, and her body dropped against the two holding her. One of them bit down on a sound. The forest listened. A clean road might have turned this into a rescue, but the mud made every act of mercy heavier with each step. One person supported her shoulder, another lifted under her arm, and the young woman bent to move a branch aside without letting it snap back loudly. Their hands were gentle, but their movements had to stay fast. Tenderness had to keep pace with fear. It barely could. The injured girl tried again to pull away. This time her fingers pushed at the sleeve of the woman helping her, and her head turned slightly toward the darker trees, as if she could make herself smaller by choosing to be left there. Her face was pale, with dirt across one cheek and hair stuck to her forehead. She did not need to say what she meant. Her hand said, "Enough." Nobody accepted it. A man ahead pointed toward a low bank where the ground rose, and roots broke the mud. If they could reach it, the tracks might be less clear. If they missed it, the soft ground behind them would show too much. The young woman shifted closer and took more of the injured girl's weight. Her own shoulder burned. Fear sometimes made people selfish, but that night it showed how much humanity they were still willing to carry. Nobody had time to name it. They were frightened, exhausted, and angry at the body that slowed them. They were also unwilling to become the kind of people who measured a life only by speed, so they dragged her on. The dogs came louder for a while, then faded behind uneven ground. That did not mean safety. It only meant the chase had bent in another direction, or the sound had been swallowed by the trees. The group reached the bank and climbed with difficulty, lifting the injured girl almost bodily over the roots. She groaned once into her sleeve. The sound stayed small. At the top, they paused just long enough to tighten the bandage. The cloth was dirty, the knot clumsy, and nobody pretended it was good enough. The young woman held the injured girl's ankle steady while another wrapped it over the dark stain. The skin above the boot looked cold and swollen. There was no lamp, only touch and guesswork. They moved again before rest became temptation. Behind them, the forest held the marks of their struggle, but less clearly now, where roots and fallen needles broke the mud. Ahead, the deeper route waited, slower and darker, but harder for men with lamps to read. The injured girl leaned heavily between them. She was still breathing. By that time the barking faded into the far trees. The group no longer felt like people escaping a single patrol. They felt like people carrying the cost of every choice made since the train first appeared in the dark. The strike, the village, the search, the informer, the missing names, and now this wounded body between them had become one long burden. No victory had ended it. It only changed its form. They did not leave the injured girl behind, even though every slow step through the mud made capture more possible. If they survived that night, the price would not disappear, because it would settle into their bodies and change the way they heard every train afterward. By the time another whistle crossed the forest, the young woman would no longer know whether she was hearing a target, a warning, or the voices of those who never came back. Another train passed far from the forest later that night. It did not come close enough to shake the ground beneath her body, and its light never reached the trees where she sat alone with her back against a trunk. Only the whistle travelled over the dark, long and thin, carrying through branches damp air, and the last low breath of the covered fire behind her. She lifted her head when she heard it. The sound should have been simple. A train was moving somewhere beyond the forest, on rails she could not see, through fields she could only imagine. Before the war, that sound might have meant distance, travel, work, or someone going home late under a tired sky. Now it reached her like something heavier. She could not tell what she was hearing. Maybe it was another target. Maybe it was another piece of the German machine carrying fuel, ammunition, soldiers, or orders toward people who had no warning yet. Maybe it was only an ordinary transport passing through occupied land, watched by guards who believed the night belonged to them. The whistle faded, then seemed to return inside her head. It stayed there. She sat with one knee drawn close and one hand resting against the mud on her coat. Her fingers were dirty, with soil still packed near the nails from the night they waited by the rails. A small fire burned behind her, covered low enough that it gave almost no warmth. Its faint light touched her eyes without reaching the trees. The forest held the rest. The train they had struck was gone from sight, but it had left a sound inside her that no silence could clear away. Victory had not emptied the rails. It had not removed the war from the countryside. It had only made the sound of trains more crowded, filled with smoke, dogs, the village square, the injured girl's breath, and the missing place beside the route. One whistle could carry all of it. partisans who survived long enough in occupied territory not only endured hunger, cold, and physical danger, they also lived with repeated fear, sudden loss, retaliation against civilians, and the pressure of acting again after seeing what one action could cost. A damaged train might be a success on a map. In a human body, success could still leave trembling hands. She thought of the night before the strike, when the rails trembled under her cheek, and anger had seemed simple enough to hold. The train then looked like a thing carrying war outward. She had been afraid, but the fear had direction. Now the sound was harder. It carried questions she did not want to answer. The whistle stretched once more across the trees. She did not know whether to hate it, fear it, or listen to it like a warning. Her shoulders tightened under the coat, and her jaw held still until the sound thinned. A person could survive the first danger and still be changed by the way it returned in memory. She understood that now. A whistle that once belonged to distance had become a kind of roll call, naming the train, the village, the wounded, and the people who had not returned without speaking any of their names. Nobody around the fire asked her what she heard. They heard their own versions of it. One man looked toward the ground. Another rubbed mud from his boot with a stick long after the mud was already gone. Everyone kept busy. The young woman had expected anger to feel stronger after the action. Instead, it felt heavier. She was no less angry at the Germans, not less certain that the railways mattered, not less aware that the occupation fed itself through lines like the one they had struck. But certainty now had weight around it. She had seen the cost move from track to village to forest to flesh. Her pride, if it existed, was difficult to name. It was not the bright pride of a clean victory. It was something quieter, mixed with exhaustion and shame that did not fully belong to her, but followed her anyway. The train had been stopped. People had been taken. A wounded comrade had been carried through the mud. These truths could not be separated neatly. She leaned her head back against the trunk. Bark pressed against her scarf, and the cold worked through the damp cloth at her shoulders. Her eyes stayed open, though she needed sleep. Whenever she closed them, she saw the light on the rails, the flash in the dark, the dog near the pit, and the mother in the kitchen. Sleep had become another place where the war entered. The hardest change was not that she feared trains now, but that she could no longer hear them as only machines. Each one seemed to carry choices, punishment, timing, hunger, orders, and people who would be forced to pay for decisions made far away or in rooms too small for the burden. A train whistle could cross miles in seconds, so could guilt. Behind her, someone covered the fire with more earth. The light dimmed until only a dull red point remained under the ash. She turned slightly, watching the movement of hands in the dark, the careful pressure of dirt over heat, the habit of hiding even what comfort they had. Then she looked back toward the direction of the unseen railway. The whistle was gone. No one allowed her to sit with memory for long. Before dawn, there would be another message, another route, another warning, another decision about where to move and what to risk. War did not pause because one person needed to understand what had happened to her. It simply handed her the next task. She rose slowly. Her legs were stiff, and the mud at her hem had dried into a hard edge. She brushed at it once, uselessly, then stopped. Somewhere beyond the trees, the train continued into the night, and she could not know whether it would reach its destination or become someone else's problem later. She only knew the sound had changed. So had she. The first strike had ended, but the train whistle proved that the war had not loosened its grip on the forest, the village, or her own memory. She would not be allowed to remain beside that tree, listening to ghosts inside the sound, because more rail lines, more supplies, and more German movements would keep demanding attention. Another map would soon be opened, and she would have to learn that one damaged train was only a small cut in a machine large enough to keep bleeding others. On a German map, the damaged railway might have looked like a small interruption. A line was marked, a delay was written down, a bridge repair was ordered, and a unit that expected supplies by one route had to wait or move another way. Somewhere a clerk might have changed a schedule without knowing the faces of the people who had caused it. Down in the forest, the partisans knew only their small corner of the damage. The young woman sat near a rough table inside a hidden shelter with a folded railway map spread under a weak light. Red marks had been placed along different points, not all made by her group, and not all close enough for them to understand fully. Her hand rested beside a piece of black bread that had gone hard at the edge. Through the small gap between branches, the forest looked dark and wet. They had damaged one train. Others somewhere else had cut a wire, delayed a convoy, damaged a bridge, or forced guards to stand longer along a vulnerable line. None of these actions looked like a grand victory when seen up close. They looked like hunger, risk, mud, and people moving before dawn. But together, they made the occupation work harder. A war machine needed more than men willing to fight. It needed fuel at the right place, ammunition at the right hour, food before soldiers weakened, spare parts before engines failed, and orders before units moved into the wrong place. Railways carried much of that weight across occupied land. When they were disrupted, even briefly, the effects could travel farther than the blast itself. Delay had value. Their work did not destroy the German army, but it made the army spend strength protecting the roads and rails it depended on. That mattered because guards placed along a railway were guards not used somewhere else. Repair crews sent to fix a line were not repairing another route. Officers forced to change plans lost time. Time was a kind of pressure. The young woman understood the need for honesty in this. One group in the forest could not win the whole war alone. One damaged train could not free the villagers, stop the arrests, or erase the fear from her mother's face. A railway strike could slow the enemy, but it could also bring searchers, dogs, and punishment. Both truths had to sit together. Someone across the table moved a finger along the map, stopping where another line joined the first. The mark was small, but everyone leaned closer. If a train were delayed here, then supplies might be late there. If guards were moved to protect one route, another road might become thinner for a night. The logic was cold. Their lives were warm. A single red mark on the map looked almost too small for the bruises, hunger, and fear it had cost. The young woman looked at it and thought of the injured girl being carried through mud, of the empty place beside the tree, of the village square, and of the dog breathing near the pit. None of that appeared on the paper. The map only showed the effect, not the price. Still, the effect was real. German forces in occupied territories often had to respond to partisan attacks by repairing tracks, guarding bridges, changing schedules, escorting trains, and searching surrounding areas. Every response consumed men, fuel, time, and attention. A strong army could absorb many small cuts, but it still had to bleed effort through each one. That was the point. The partisans did not need to pretend they were larger than they were. Their strength was not in defeating every German unit directly. It was in making movement uncertain, making supply slower, making routine dangerous, and reminding the occupiers that roads through conquered land were never completely theirs. This was not a clean kind of pride. It was measured and tired. The young woman broke a small piece from the hard bread and held it between her fingers without eating. The bread, the map, the red marks, and the forest beyond the wall all belonged to the same war now. A piece of food from a mother, a path through mud, a hidden signal, a delayed church in the village, were not certain separate things anymore. They were joined. What kept her steady was not the belief that one strike changed everything, but the knowledge that doing nothing would let every train pass, as if the land itself had surrendered. That thought did not make the fear disappear. It only gave the fear a task. She could live with fear more easily when it had somewhere to go. Outside, the forest shifted under a light wind. Someone covered the lamp for a moment, and the room fell into near darkness. When the light returned, the red marks on the railway map seemed smaller than before. The young woman noticed that her hand had moved closer to them. She pulled it back. The machine they faced was too large to imagine fully from a shelter made of branches and mud. It had offices, depots, tracks, telephones, repair crews, armed patrols, and soldiers who had never heard her name. But machines were made of parts, and parts could fail. That was the narrow truth they worked with. It was enough to keep moving. By the end of the meeting, no one spoke as if victory were near. They folded the map, divided the bread, and decided which routes were too dangerous to use again. A train had been stopped, but more would come. The forest would have to answer each one with caution, not fantasy. There was no room for exaggeration. Each damaged train was only a small cut in a much larger machine. But small cuts could still force that machine to slow guard, repair, and worry. The more the partisans made German movement uncertain, the more the Germans would answer by turning forests, villages, and roads into hunting grounds. The next danger would not be a train in the dark, but a full Nazi hunt, meant to make the entire forest afraid to breathe. German soldiers entered the forest in a line that looked too organized for the wet ground, their boots pressed through leaves, their rifles pointed toward the dark spaces between trees, and the dogs pulled hard against their leashes, as if the whole forest had become a body they were trying to tear open. Far beyond the trunks, a column of smoke rose from the direction of a village. The young woman saw it from behind a tree and did not move. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep. Mud had dried along her sleeves, and her scarf had slipped low at one side. But she did not lift a hand to fix it. Any movement could catch light. Any sound could bring the dogs closer. She kept one shoulder against the bark and watched the soldiers pass between grey trunks. The forest had become narrow. A single shot cracked somewhere to the left. It was not followed by a battle, only by silence, and then a shout carried weakly through branches. No one in the partisan group answered it. No one ran toward it. The young woman's jaw tightened, because not knowing who had been shot was another kind of wound. Still, she stayed hidden. These hunts were not only searches for the people who had damaged trains. German anti-partisan operations often moved through villages and forests together, using patrols, dogs, informers, burned houses, hostages, threats, and public punishment to separate resistance fighters from the people who helped them. The purpose was practical and psychological at the same time. Find some partisans, frighten everyone else. The Germans were not only hunting bodies in the trees, but they were also hunting the courage that allowed a village to leave bread, warnings, and silence in the right places. If a mother feared giving food, if a boy feared carrying a sign, if an old woman feared sitting by a window too long, then the forest would begin to starve. A rifle could kill one person. Fear could cut the whole network. The young woman looked again toward the smoke. It rose slowly, thick at the bottom and thinner as it reached the pale sky, and she could not tell whether it came from a barn, a house, or a pile of belongings dragged outside and burned. Her hands closed around the rough bark until tiny pieces broke under her fingers. She wanted to go back. Wanting did nothing. A man beside her touched the ground once with 2 fingers, a signal to stay low. His face was set, but his mouth had gone tight at the corners. Another partisan crouched behind a fallen trunk, one hand over the strap of his bag to keep it from shifting. The dogs came closer, then veered away toward a lower patch of brush. Everyone held still. The forest no longer felt like a shelter simply. It still hid them, but it also trapped every sound under branches and made distance hard to judge. A shout could seem close, then vanish. A dog could sound far away, then appear within seconds. Smoke from the village seemed to follow them even when the wind changed. Nothing stayed outside. A burned house did not have to be beside them to make the air harder to breathe. They knew what the smoke meant even without seeing the flames. It meant someone had paid because the railway had not remained safe. It meant the Germans wanted every village watching smoke to understand the cost of helping. The message was meant to travel farther than the fire. By afternoon, the hunt widened. Patrols moved along the road and through the lower trees, while others checked barns, sheds, and paths leading toward the swamps. German voices rose and fell in short commands. Once, a dog barked so close that the young woman felt her stomach pull inward before her mind caught up. Her body remembered the pit of leaves. It remembered the boot above her face. They moved only when the patrol line shifted away. One by one, they slipped through a patch of thicker brush, placing their feet where roots broke the mud and avoiding the open ground where wet soil could hold a print. The young woman's legs shook from crouching too long. Her throat was dry. No one asked for water. The hunt did not need to catch them that hour to succeed. It had already changed their routes, delayed their messages, cut them away from the village, and made every helper wonder whether the next loaf of bread would bring soldiers to the door. That was the larger purpose. It was not just to kill people with weapons. It was to make the unarmed afraid of being near them. The worst pressure was knowing that every step they took to survive might bring danger to someone else. If they moved toward a friendly barn, that barn could be watched. If they sent a message through the old route, the messenger could be followed. If they stayed too long near the village could burn harder. Even hiding had consequences. Near dusk, the smoke faded into the sky, but the smell seemed to remain in her thoughts. A messenger tried to reach them and failed. A second route was closed before anyone could use it. The small group had less food, less certainty, and no safe way to learn who had been taken. The young woman sat behind a root with her knees drawn in, listening to the forest become dark again. No one spoke of heroism. They spoke of water, tracks, dogs, patrol direction, and whether the lower stream could still be crossed. Survival had become a list of small habits done correctly while grief waited in the background. The young woman wiped mud from her palm, then stopped when she realized the mud was hiding the pale skin beneath. Even her hands had learned to disappear. By night, the soldiers had not found them. That should have felt like relief, but relief was too large to trust. The forest was still surrounded in parts. The village was still hurt. And the next mistake could undo all the small care that had kept them alive. They remained where they were, breathing quietly beneath branches that had heard too much. The hunt had not ended. It had only moved. The Nazi hunt had failed to catch them that day. But it had spread fear through the forest, the village, and every hidden route that kept the partisans alive. If they survived from here, it would not be because of one brave act, but because of hundreds of small habits repeated without mercy. A covered footprint, a burned scrap of paper, a changed name, or one divided piece of bread could decide who lived until morning. A footprint disappeared under a handful of wet leaves before the sun had fully reached trees. A scrap of paper burned in a tin bowl until the writing curled into black flakes. A password changed for breakfast, and the old one was not spoken again, not even as a joke. In a village cellar, a wounded person lay hidden under sacks of potatoes, breathing through pain while boots crossed the floor above. None of these things looked large by themselves. A leaf over mud, a burned note, a changed name, a divided piece of bread, a road avoided for one more day. They were too small for a monument and too ordinary for a clean story. But this was how people stayed alive. Survival was made of small refusals to be careless. Inside the forest shelter, a rough table held the objects of their world. There was a folded map with damp edges, black bread wrapped in cloth, strips of grey bandage, a small knife, a burnt paper corner, and a pair of gloves stiff with dried mud. The young woman sat beside it with her coat still on, because nobody trusted warmth enough to remove too much. Her hands rested near the bread. Her eyes kept moving. Partisan survival depended on many things working at once. They needed terrain that could hide them, villagers who could help without being seen, small networks that did not reveal too much, food that could reach them without forming a trail, and enough discipline to avoid repeating the same route. They needed courage, but courage alone would have failed quickly. Hunger, mud, trolls, dogs, and informers did not care about courage. They cared about mistakes. The truth was not that they had one secret method, but that they lived by hundreds of small habits that could not fail too many times. One person forgot to cover a print, and a patrol might find a direction. One messenger used the same path twice, and a watcher might learn it. One name was spoken near the wrong wall, and a family might be dragged outside before dawn. Nothing was too small to matter. The young woman had learned to look behind herself without turning her head too sharply. She had learned to step on roots when the mud was soft, to loosen her grip on a basket when passing soldiers, to hold a cough until her chest hurt, and to stop using a name the moment it became dangerous. These were not heroic skills from a poster. They were tired skills. They kept bodies breathing. Bread was divided with the same care as information. Nobody took what hunger wanted. A piece was broken, passed, reduced, and saved for someone who might arrive late from a route nobody else knew. When a hand lingered over the bread too long, another person looked away instead of shaming them. Hunger was private. Sharing made it bearable. A woman in the village hid a wounded partisan beneath potatoes for part of one day. She did not know the whole group, and she did not ask. She only knew that the person needed silence, water, and a little time before the patrol moved on. Her own children stayed upstairs, told to speak less than usual. The house held its breath. Care in this world had to be quiet enough to deny, practical enough to work, and brave enough to risk the person giving it. A bandage could be as important as a rifle if it kept someone moving. A dry pair of socks could matter when cold feet slowed a night crossing. A bowl of soup, a changed sign, or a barn left unlocked could save a route. The war lived in these details. The young woman cleaned mud from one glove and found a tear near the thumb. She stitched it badly with dark thread, pulling the needle through stiff cloth, while listening to two others discuss a road they would no longer use. The old path had been safe once. That was exactly why it had become dangerous. Anything used too often began to speak. No one trusted routine. They changed where they slept, how they approached the village, which person carried a message, and which sign meant the road was clear. Sometimes the change felt unnecessary. Sometimes it felt cruel, but a life in the forest depended on not waiting for proof that danger had already found them. By then, proof could arrive with dogs. Her pride, when it came, did not feel bright, because it was mixed with dirty sleeves, sore feet, and the knowledge that each safe morning had been bought with fear. Still, she felt it in small ways. A footprint vanished under leaves. A messenger returned. A wounded girl survived another night. A German patrol passed close and found nothing. These were victories too. By the time night returned, the table in the shelter looked almost the same as before. Bread, cloth knife, map, ash, gloves. But the old password was gone. The route had changed, and someone who had been hidden in a potato cellar was already being moved before the moon rose. The system was fragile, but it was alive. So were they. The young woman looked toward the dark beyond the shelter and thought again of the railway. All of these small habits, all this hunger and silence, all these hidden names and erased prints, existed because trains still moved through the night. Somewhere out there, the metal line waited under cold air. She knew what it meant now. She had learned. They survived not through one great secret, but through leaves over footprints, burned paper, changed names, shared bread, and the refusal to trust the same road twice. All those small acts would lead back to the railway, where a village girl had first learned that ordinary knowledge could slow a machine built for war. In the final memory, the forest would grow over the old paths, the rails would shine again, and the unnamed women who once lay in the mud would remain almost invisible beneath history. After the war, the railway was repaired. The bent rails were replaced, the damaged sleepers were removed, and trains passed again over ground that had once burned in the dark. Grass grew back along the edge of the track, and the forest slowly covered old paths that had been used by people moving without names. From a distance, the place could look peaceful again, but beneath the leaves there had once been women lying still in mud, holding their breath while dogs passed close enough to hear. There had been bread divided into pieces too small to satisfy hunger, messages hidden inside ordinary errands, and real names left unsaid because a captured person could not read what they had never been told. There had been girls who knew mushrooms, firewood paths, wet ground, and village shortcuts before war turned that knowledge into survival. They were not born as legends, they were pushed there. Female partisans in World War II did not serve in one single way. Depending on the country, the region, the network, and the danger around them, they carried messages, watched roads, scouted rail lines, hid fugitives, moved supplies, nursed the wounded, guarded routes, fought when needed, and helped sabotage the systems that kept the occupation moving. Some were young, some were older, some were remembered by name, and many were not. Their work was often quiet until it became deadly. The mistake would be to imagine them as simple action figures in the forest, because their real story was much heavier than one burning train. They not only struck rails and vanished into trees, they lived afterward with the searchers, the missing people, the punished villagers, the wounded and carried through mud. And the question nobody wanted to ask aloud: a successful attack could slow the enemy and still leave guilt behind. Both things could be true. That is what makes this story difficult to clean. The German trains carried soldiers, fuel, ammunition, orders, and supplies through occupied land. Disrupting them mattered. It forced delays, repairs, guards, fear, and confusion into a system that depended on movement. But the people who paid first were not always soldiers. Sometimes they were mothers in village squares, old men questioned beside church walls, children told to stay silent, and neighbours whose doors were kicked open before dawn. The forest protected the partisans, but it also demanded discipline from them every hour. A footprint had to be covered, a fire had to be hidden, a path had to be abandoned before it became familiar, the password had to change, a name had to disappear. Survival was not one dramatic act, it was hundreds of small decisions made while hungry, cold, hunted, and tired enough to make mistakes. There is a quiet sadness in the image of an older woman standing at the edge of the forest after the war, holding an old cloth while the railway lies silent in the distance. Maybe she remembers a daughter. Maybe she remembers someone who never came back. Maybe she remembers nothing she can safely explain, because even after victory, some memories remain too tangled with fear, shame, and grief to become a simple story. The cloth in her hand is not a medal, it is a remnant. The women who helped slow the Nazi war machine did not do it with clean certainty. They did it with anger that had been pressed down too long, with discipline learned from danger, with village knowledge, with hidden bread, with maps folded under weak light, and with choices that could stain the conscience even when the cause was necessary. They knew that a train was not only recruitment, it was movement, supply, command, punishment, and occupation on wheels. Yet they also knew that resistance could reach beyond the person who carried it. One action could bring trucks to a village. One mistake could lead dogs into the forest. One frightened informer could make a safe path deadly. This did not make resistance meaningless. It made it human. It made it costly. What stays at the end is not a beautiful myth, but a more honest kind of courage, the kind that keeps moving even when every choice has a price. These women slowed trains, carried the wounded, hid their names, protected one another by knowing less, and disappeared into forest that history often remembers only as background. They were not background. They were part of the reason the machine had to work harder, guard more roads, repair more lines, and fear the land it tried to control. So, when we imagine them, it should not be only with fire behind them and victory in their faces. We should imagine the wet sleeves, the stiff hands, the bread hidden in a coat, the mother at the door, the old map on the table, the dog breathing near the pit, and the silence after a name was not spoken. That is where the truth lives. Not in the explosion alone. By the time the war ended, many tracks were repaired, many villages tried to become ordinary again, and many people learned to speak carefully about what they had done or lost. Some stories were written down. Others stayed in families, in fragments, or vanished with those who carried them. The forest grew over the paths. The trains returned. The unnamed remained. Female partisans did not defeat Nazi Germany alone, but they made its war machine slower, more nervous, and less certain on the land it tried to command. Their story ends not with a perfect victory, but with repaired rails, hidden graves, old women holding scraps of cloth, and names that were never fully recorded. And as this night closes, remember them quietly, rest your eyes, and sleep well, because history is often carried by people who disappeared before anyone could thank them.